A threat in the night. The midnight air carried the scent of salt and citrus through the coastal hills of Sicily, where the grand villa of Lady Valentina Orsini loomed over the darkened sea. It was a house of old wealth, built upon secrets whispered through marble corridors and candlelit halls. Tonight, however, those secrets had stirred, manifesting as a gnawing paranoia that sent her trembling hands to the phone, seeking the one man whose name carried both reverence and unease. Francesco Mori arrived in silence, the low hum of his car dissipating as he stepped onto the gravel driveway. The house stood defiantly against cliffs, its large windows reflecting the slivers of moonlight. The mere mention of his name had likely unsettled the staff. No one ever said Mori without a glance over the shoulder. There were too many tales, too many unspoken truths about his lineage. He paid them no mind. Tonight, he was here to do what he did best: trace shadows, read the language of fear, and uncover the predator lurking beneath it all. The moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted. Valentina Orsini was no stranger to luxury, nor to the attention it drew. An heiress to a shipping empire, her life had been one of extravagant parties and whispered negotiations. But her composed exterior faltered when she led him to the hall, her normally poised footsteps betraying a nervous urgency. She did not need to say much. A glance toward the shattered porcelain heirloom on the polished wooden floor said enough. At the center of destruction lay a small note, pinned beneath a jagged fragment of what had once been an exquisite hand-painted vase. The edges of the parchment were curled and yellowed, as if plucked from an age long past. The ink, though faded, still carried a deliberate weight. It bore a phrase Mori had not heard in years, a reference to an ancient Sicilian vow, whispered to the generations like a curse, a warning, or perhaps a claim. The words clung to the air, laden with history. The vow was something his family had abandoned long ago, a relic of a darker past. And yet, here it was placed deliberately before him, not merely a threat to Valentina, but a message intended for him. Mori did not believe in coincidences. The method, the precision, it was calculated. Someone had chosen Valentina Orsini not just for who she was, but for what she represented. A name deeply entangled in the old world, in trade routes that once smuggled more than goods, in debts that were never truly settled. The study bore further proof that this was no simple act of vandalism. The room had not been ransacked in a frenzy. The intruder had moved with purpose, disturbing only what needed to be seen. A faint trace of expensive cologne still lingered near the bookshelves, almost masked beneath the scent of aged paper and polished wood. One book had been pulled slightly from its place, an extensive volume on Sicilian maritime law. A calculated mind had been at work here, someone who knew precisely what Mori would recognize. Stepping onto the balcony, he surveyed the darkened cliffs below. The sea stretched endlessly beyond, its surface broken only by the occasional flash of moonlight. Somewhere within that abyss, a trail had been laid for him to follow. A rustling in the wind made him turn sharply. Near the far end of the terrace, half hidden in shadow, a footprint disturbed the otherwise pristine tiles. The faint smear of dampness suggested someone had been standing here moments before his arrival, watching, waiting. This was no ordinary break-in. The note, the heirloom, the carefully placed traces, they all pointed to something far greater than a threat against one woman's safety. This was a message wrapped in history, an invitation to step into a game where the pieces had long been in motion. And Mori knew one thing for certain: the game had only just begun. Secrets and seduction. The morning sun painted the villa in gold, but the warmth did little to dispel the cold weight of the previous night's revelation. Francesco Mori moved through the estate with measured steps, his mind already assembling the puzzle. The note had not been a mere taunt. It was a deliberate summons, invoking a history that should have remained buried. Whoever had orchestrated this had done so with precision, their knowledge of Sicilian bloodlines and forgotten vows far too intimate to be coincidence. Valentina Orsini, though visibly shaken, had revealed something of interest. For weeks, she had received cryptic messages, each one growing more ominous. At first, they were harmless riddles slipped between the pages of her ledgers, subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence. But soon, they had become impossible to ignore. A letter signed with an unfamiliar crest, a shadow in her periphery vanishing when she turned, the sensation of being watched, the feeling of a noose tightening. Mori traced her accounts with a scrutinizing eye, following the path of her wealth, the transactions, the silent undercurrents of influence. It did not take long to uncover a pattern. Small but consistent withdrawals, funds funneled into offshore accounts with no discernible owner. Someone had been extorting her, not for the money itself, but for what it represented. A claim. There was something within her lineage, an inheritance of power beyond wealth, and someone had decided it was time to collect. Seeking answers, Mori made his way to Palermo, where the scent of old paper and ink guided him to an exclusive museum archive. The curator, Isabella Moreau, was an expert in Sicilian history, and more importantly, she knew how to interpret the language of the past. She was a woman who carried knowledge like a blade, sharp, elegant, and dangerous in the wrong hands. The first moment their paths crossed, there was an unspoken tension. She studied him with the practiced gaze of someone who could read between the lines, sensing the weight of his past before he could shield it. If she recognized the name Mori, she did not let it show. Instead, she listened as he laid out the peculiar details of Valentina's case, her expression shifting only when he mentioned the ancient vow. That was when she led him to a locked chamber deep within the archives. Here, beneath the cold glow of antique chandeliers, she revealed an aged manuscript bound in fading leather. Within its pages, Mori found the symbol from the note, a crest belonging to a secretive Sicilian order, long thought to be extinct. But what truly caught his attention was the accompanying passage. It spoke of a relic, an artifact that had changed hands over centuries, always linked to those who sought control over Sicily's underworld. It was a key, both metaphorical and literal, to a legacy that had shaped the balance of power in ways few understood. If Valentina's name was tied to this, then the threats against her were no longer about money. Someone believed she possessed the artifact, or knew where to find it. Their research deepened into the night, each uncovered detail tightening the web of intrigue. And yet, amid the flood of revelations, there was something else, a pull between them, a quiet challenge in the way Isabella met his gaze, the way she held her ground against his unrelenting focus. There was a certainty in her presence, a confidence that suggested she was not easily intimidated. If Mori had expected her to be merely an academic, he had underestimated her. As the clock neared midnight, their search led them to a coded ledger hidden within the museum's private collection. It contained names, dates, transactions, all tied to the smuggling of artifacts, a silent trade that stretched beyond borders, protected by those who thrived in the shadows. And among the entries, one name stood out: Mori, not Francesco, his ancestor. It was then that they sensed it, the subtle shift in the air, the awareness that they were no longer alone. A shadow flickered beyond the stained glass window, movement so slight it could have been mistaken for nothing. But Mori knew better. Someone had been watching, and then, as if to confirm his suspicions, Isabella found an envelope slipped between the pages of an open book. The message inside was simple, yet it carried the weight of an unspoken threat. Stop searching, or suffer the consequences. The game was escalating, and now they were both players. Mafia echoes Unveiled. The streets of Palermo breathed history. Narrow alleyways wove through ancient stone buildings, each corner whispering secrets from an era long before the present danger had taken root. Francesco Mori moved through the city with practiced ease, his senses attuned to the unspoken language of those who thrived in the shadows. The letter had been a warning, but warnings only carried weight if one chose to heed them. Mori had never been one to turn away. Isabella Moreau had hesitated, not in fear, but in contemplation. She was a woman who weighed risks like an archaeologist examining a fragile relic, aware of its power, yet unwilling to let it slip into the wrong hands. She had seen the name in the ledger, the tie to Mori's ancestor, and now she looked at him with quiet calculation. There was something unspoken in her gaze. Not distrust, but the careful consideration of a woman who understood that history had a way of repeating itself. Mori did not offer explanations. He knew what she must be wondering. That name, written decades ago, had tied his bloodline to the very conspiracy they were unraveling. And now, someone was trying to use that history to push him away. That someone made themselves known soon enough. The first sign was a tale, subtle, but not enough to escape Mori's notice. A man lingered too long outside the museum, another near the cafe where Isabella had retreated to review the ledger's contents. Their presence was calculated, not an immediate attack, but a statement, a reminder that they were being watched. Then came the invitation, not written in ink, but delivered in the language of old debts. A quiet message passed through the right hands, reaching Mori with the weight of something inevitable. He had been summoned. The location was a private club, one of those places where the past still dictated the rules, where names held power and history was not a burden but a currency. The kind of place where men like Mori were both welcomed and feared. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cigars and aged whiskey. Dim lights cast long shadows over velvet seats and polished mahogany tables. At the far end of the room, a man waited, not a stranger. Vittorio Leone, an old name, a reminder of the world Mori had left behind. Vittorio had the air of a man who commanded without raising his voice. He was older now, his hair touched with silver, but his presence was unchanged, heavy, undeniable. He regarded Mori with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly what he was, what he could be, if only he chose to embrace the legacy that had been carved for him long before he had drawn his first breath. There was no need for pleasantries. Vittorio had not called him here for conversation. He spoke of the past, of obligations left unfulfilled, of a time when names like Mori and Leone had dictated the course of power in Sicily. He made it clear that there were those who still remembered, who still expected the old alliances to hold. And then he delivered his warning. Step away from this investigation. Some things were not meant to be uncovered. Some legacies, when disturbed, demanded payment in blood. Mori did not answer. He did not need to. The silence between them was enough. Vittorio understood. The meeting had been nothing more than a courtesy, a final offer. By the time Mori left the club, he knew the choice had already been made. The moment he had stepped onto this path, there had only ever been one direction forward, returning to Isabella. He found her waiting in the archive, the ledger still open before her. She did not ask where he had been, but there was something in the way she regarded him now, a quiet understanding, a realization of what this meant for him. The past was no longer just a shadow trailing behind him. It had reached out, wrapping around this case, around Valentina, around Isabella herself. And then, the final revelation, among the ledger's coded entries. Isabella had found a reference to an upcoming auction, a private affair, held in an estate where only the most elite would be welcomed. The artifact, the one tied to the vow, to the history now unraveling around them, was to be sold to the highest bidder. The conspirators were not hiding anymore. They were ready to make their move. And Mori was ready to stop them. But first they had to get inside. The Veil of Power. The grand estate loomed over the Sicilian countryside, its opulence veiling the quiet corruption that simmered within. Tonight, beneath crystal chandeliers and the soft hum of a string quartet, power would change hands, not through politics or influence, but through the silent language of wealth and secrecy. The auction was more than a mere exchange of artifacts. It was a transaction of legacy, a reshuffling of the invisible forces that had dictated the fate of those who dared to play the game. Francesco Mori and Isabella Moreau had slipped into this world as ghosts, their presence concealed beneath tailored elegance and carefully measured confidence. The invitation had been forged, the aliases crafted, and their entry secured. Here, among oligarchs, collectors, and men whose power thrived in the absence of scrutiny, they would find the artifact, the object that had bound Valentina Orsini to this fate, and unearth the long-buried sins of Mori's ancestry. The room pulsed with quiet tension, each guest engaged in conversations laced with veiled threats and whispered alliances. Isabella moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her knowledge of history making her an effortless player in this dangerous theater. She spoke of provenance and antiquity, drawing attention away from Mori, who scanned the room for the true puppeteers behind this night's affairs. Then the bidding began. A velvet curtain parted, revealing a collection of items displayed beneath golden light. Priceless relics, stolen fragments of history, each carrying a story of conquest and betrayal. But there at the center lay the true prize, an ornate key, a simple object in appearance, but one weighted with far greater significance. The symbol engraved into its surface matched the crest from a note, the same emblem that had traced its lineage through blood and violence. It was no mere artifact. It was a claim, a right to something vast, something hidden in the depths of Sicily's most guarded secrets. And the bidders knew its worth. The numbers climbed with quiet ruthlessness, each offer punctuated by the flick of a wrist, the nod of a head. Mori watched as the figures shifted, the competition narrowing to only those who truly understood what was at stake. Then, a presence at his side. Vittorio Leone. The message was clear. Mori had been warned. This was not his to take. But warnings meant nothing now. As the final bids were placed, Mori moved, not with reckless abandon, but with the precision of a man who had anticipated every possible outcome. The moment the auctioneer prepared to close the sale, chaos erupted. The power flickered, the hum of machinery failing for the briefest moment, just enough to create confusion, to shift the balance. Mori struck like a phantom, slipping through the unraveling order, his path carved through the fractures of the illusion these men had built. The key was within reach, but so were the hands of those who would kill to keep it from him. Isabella played her part too. She had studied not only history, but the art of deception, a whispered word here, a well-timed misdirection there. By the time the first gun was drawn, she had already set the final move in motion. In the end, the key was no longer in the hands of those who had sought to control it. The estate burned in the distance as Mori and Isabella disappeared into the night, the weight of their discovery pressing against them like the Sicilian air before a storm. The vow, the artifact, the bloodlines, they had all converged upon this moment. But the true game had only just begun. For in the quiet hours before dawn, a final message arrived. A package, a document, a single phrase written upon parchment older than time itself. This was never about the key. It was about what it unlocks. The hunt was far from over.